Owen Thompson to move the motion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mundell, and I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to move this motion today. Very grateful that the opportunity has arisen, but I'm also finding it genuinely hard to believe that we are having to have this debate again at all. It's now 16 months since the government should have filled the gaps in eligibility for its COVID support schemes. In that time, I and countless other members across the House have raised the issues of the exclusion of 3 million people from government support, personally in 5 oral questions, 7 speeches, dozens of written questions and 3 debates that I've personally led. Yet progress has been minimal. At the start of the pandemic, I and many others could understand that the government's argument that it was inevitable some people would temporarily fall through gaps during such an unprecedented time. Likewise, I accept and welcome the instances where the government has taken constructive steps to plug those gaps. I don't dispute that some progress has also been made, so I'd be mindful for the Minister doesn't squander his valuable time today simply listing all of the things that have been done and where we could perhaps focus on where those gaps still exist. If it's the role of government to protect and better the lives and livelihoods of citizens, it's incomprehensible that 10% of the working population can be accepted as collateral damage and left to be ground down to poverty and despair by a government that claims to be business friendly. So instead of looking backwards at what's already been done, I want to focus on where these gaps still exist and look ahead to what can be done to tackle the long-term effects of the government's decision to let temporary gaps in support become a full-blown crisis of debt, poverty and mental health. The Minister will be very well aware that over 800,000 people have been unable to access the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme due to last year's RTI cut-off date. And though I'm sure that he's no doubt champing at the bit to stand up here and give the Treasury a pat on the back for the decision to amend the date to November, I think it's better use of our time and those affected. What are they telling us? That this does nothing to support those who missed out on furlough because their roles as PAYE freelancers or annually paid limited company directors. And while March's budget inclusion of the 2019-20 tax returns in calculating eligibility for the self-employed income support scheme is welcome, the Treasury's assertion that this will open eligibility to 600,000 more self-employed people is categorically disputed by campaigners. Likewise, the discretionary grant funds devised by the UK Government and devolved governments have been effective in plugging some of the gaps in places. The eligibility criteria varies from council to council, keeping some groups excluded based on postcode alone, some because they don't have a premises, some because they have too many employees, and the list goes on. This is something the Treasury could fix, either by issuing clear guidance on who councils should consider to be eligible, or by distributing its own grant scheme rather than devolving the blame. And to save the Minister a bit of time later, I'm well aware of the Government's Cultural Recovery Fund, but the scheme doesn't do very much at all to support many of my constituents who work in the supply chain, businesses for the event sector who've remained formally open, yet have been so badly affected by the cancellation of live events. Only 3% of this fund went to supply chain businesses at the first round. It did rise to 12.5% at the second round, but only because of the campaigning efforts of groups like We Make Events. So I do hope the Minister will explain how he intends to support those supply chain businesses excluded from this fund, rather than repeating the lines that we already know. And finally, on this point, Mr Mundell, as much as the government parrots universal credit as the last resort when all else fails, the reality is quite different. Excluded UK estimate that around 60% of the excluded have been unable to access universal credit, often due to partners working or because of savings set aside for business expenditure, such as their tax bill, which is natural for any self-employed person. I do hope the Minister will be grateful that we've already covered what the government has already done, and that we can focus today instead on the gaps identified that still exist. And some gaps have certainly been filled. I have making no qualms about that, and I would not certainly try to detract from that. But the onus now is in the government to fill the rest and not rest on its laurels. Plenty of solutions have been presented, only to end up being dismissed for spurious reasons. To sit on a minister's desk while people who could have been helped languish in stress and deprivation. For instance, proposals for a director's income support scheme were dismissed by the Treasury because of concerns about fraud and an inability to gather data on dividends, despite the scheme using the government's own anti-fraud gold standard and avoiding dealing with dividends at all. Where there is political will, there is always a way, and the government has displayed nothing but a lack of political will in these. Throughout the Sorry saga, the Treasury has shown that the views of many members, such as myself, it's becoming a broken record, and the Excluded as nuisances trying to swindle public funds. Perhaps there's a bit of self-projection going on there. Time and time again, the tone has been nothing but dismissive, such as using the blatant straw-manning to paint limited company directors as fat cats and imply that majority are actually just directors, children and spouses. Now with the Prime Minister pressing on with ditching all restrictions with trademark recklessness, I imagine ministers are rubbing their hands with glee at the chance to redirect attention to reopening and to simply dismiss or brush off the Excluded as yesterday's news. But if the government thinks that the end of restrictions will make the issue go away, they're very wrong, because for many of the Excluded, the hardest times are still to come. The fact that many jobs and businesses have survived until now doesn't mean that they're now in the clear. Those who've been excluded from one support or another have relied on loan schemes, so by tapering off support now, the government is exposing them to unimaginable crisis of toxic debt. In a Westminster Hall debate in November last year, I raised warnings from the City UK Recapitalisation Group that UK businesses will have 100 billion of toxic debt by 2021, with 35 billion of that related to government schemes. The report warned that up to 3 million jobs across the UK and 780,000 small and medium enterprises are at risk. Here we are now, standing at the edge of that very precipice, after many have only just managed to scrape by in meeting the first repayment deadline for CBILS or bounce-back loans. How does the Treasury expect entrepreneurs to recap the benefits of an open economy when the profits of so many are simply going to go straight to repaying ever-mounting debts? How many businesses will fold that were saved through the pandemic, only to close and only to collapse when debt and the health crisis finally over? And is the government really content with giving some companies in the same sector competitive advantage by saddling others with debt? As we reopen, things are more uncertain than ever for the Excluded, especially with the reopening process likely to be a bumpy one. For as long as COVID is still out there, cancellations, changes of plan can create deep uncertainty, such as in my own constituency, Midlothian, where only last week a Tough Mudder event, which had been planned over a space of 7 months, was cancelled at 6:30 p.m. the night before it was due to start on the Saturday morning. While the health situation remains uncertain, there must at least be certainty in support as well as quality decision making, which is sadly lacking in the instance with Tough Mudder last week, I have to say. The Excluded aren't a niche group. They're the backbone of our economy, business owners and risk takers. To take one example, the events industry demonstrates their incredible potential to build a world-beating sector that boosts both the economy and our spirits, relying on the efforts of a diverse and highly skilled supply chain of around 1 million people. These people's skills should be used to boost recovery, yet so many have taken such an economic beating they literally can't carry on their current roles and sectors, with 1 million people leaving self-employment in the last year alone. So for all the government's talk of a strong economic recovery, we've been left with a looming toxic debt crisis and the decimation of key industries and sectors. The supposedly strong shoulders of the Treasury are quite happy to shrug off millions of livelihoods. And that's not even to mention the human cost: poverty, hunger and serious mental health crisis. The Trussell Trust reports that gaps in social security have driven people to food banks, and that universal credit has been totally insufficient in preventing the Excluded from falling into food poverty. Many are already being forced to sell their homes to repay CBILS and bounce-back debt, and tragically, some have already taken their own lives. It speaks volumes that groups such as Forgotten Limited have established formal links with suicide prevention charities like Samaritans, and I really hope the Minister will join me in expressing a deep appreciation for the work that these charities do in the support of the Excluded. So in conclusion, Mr Mundell, never before has a government been so complacent about a debt crisis, a mental health crisis and the grave injustice all rolled into one. Let's talk about solutions. Backdated parity of support, eligibility for support as we come out of the pandemic, support for repaying CBILS and bounce back debt, delayed repayments, or perhaps even a student loan repayment scheme that only kicks in past a certain threshold. These are just ideas, but they're kind of ideas that the government really needs to be looking at now. So will the Minister recognise the graveness of the crisis we're about to enter and commit to exploring solutions as a matter of urgency? Doing so will require striking a new tone with campaigning members and groups such as Excluded UK, We Make Events. So will the Minister agree to coordinate a meeting between the various excluded groups? It's worth noting that the people who have been excluded do watch these debates, and the last thing they want to hear today is another generic list of the people who have been supported. Not only is it a waste of our time, it's an insult to them, rubbing their faces in the injustice of the situation. It's taunting to the level of trolling. And if it is, I implore him to throw away the script and speak today as if we were speaking face to face with one of the excluded themselves. To listen to their hardships and their stories, to recognise the hurt that's out there, agree to listen to those affected, and to agree to commit to working constructively to resolve one of the greatest injustices of this generation.